Good evening, and on behalf of the committee members and staff, I would like to welcome you to the February 8th, 2022 City of Roseville Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee. My name is Kathy Kitchell, and I am the committee chair. This 5-member committee is charged with the annual review and report to the City Council on the revenue and expenditures of funds from the General Transactions and Use Tax, known as Measure B, that was passed by voters on November 6, 2018. I will now call the meeting to order. Terry, would you please take roll?
Chair Kitchell.
Present.
Vice Chair Krafka.
Present.
Committee Member Duffy.
Here.
Committee Member Hill.
Here.
Committee Member Spate.
Here.
All members are present.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America,
To the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Item 4 on our agenda is public comments. This part of the agenda, public comment, is for anyone who would like to address the committee on any item not listed on tonight's agenda. The Brown Act does not permit action on items discussed during public comments. When addressing the committee, please stand at the podium, state your name for the record, and limit your comments to 3 minutes. Any public comment at this time? Seeing none, we'll close public comment and move on to item 5, approval of minutes. Actually, item 5.1. This item is approval of the minutes of the November 30th, 2021 meeting of the Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee. Are there any comments, questions from the committee? Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve 5.1.
I'll second.
Thank you. Motion by Committee Member Kafka, seconded by Committee Member Duffy to approve the minutes of the November 30th, 2021 Local Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee meeting minutes. Now let's move on to item 6.1, year-end report, with a presentation by Dennis Kaufman, Assistant City Manager, Chief Financial Officer, on the city's year-end report. Dennis.
Good evening, Chair Kitchell and committee members. Dennis Kaufman. Tonight I'll be presenting on the 2 items that are on your agenda. The first item is the year-end report for last fiscal year 2020 and 2021. And this agenda item provided a few hundred pages for you of documentation, but I promise I'm going to bring it all together in a nice, succinct presentation for you. And as we reviewed at the November 30th committee meeting, the purpose of this meeting is to provide you with the information that the committee needs to prepare an annual report on the city's Measure B sales tax revenue and general fund expenditures, so that representatives from this committee can provide that report to the City Council, and I'll talk about the timeline of that under the next agenda item. So this agenda item has a number of exhibits attached to it, starting with the Measure B Scorecard, which we met and discussed a draft at that November 30th committee meeting. And I'm actually going to cover that scorecard last in my presentation. We'll talk a little bit about the fiscal year 2021 annual budget. And then I'll talk about the year-end actual financial results for last fiscal year, as well as a budget adjustment that we recommended to City Council last week. And the attachment to that staff report was our 4th quarter budgetary report that talked about the year-end results for last fiscal year. And then included in your packet is our annual comprehensive financial report. That's the city's audited financial statements. And I've identified there a few pages where Measure B is referenced in that document. And then I provided to you a general ledger page so that you can see the monthly payments that we received from the state California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. And attached to that is actual pages from their website showing the tax remittances from the State Department. We also included in your packet our general fund reserves policy for your reference, and we included last year's report from this committee to the City Council for your reference as you think about preparing this year's report. So first I want to talk about the budget for last fiscal year, and I've identified on this slide, and we'll get these PowerPoint to you as well so that you have these references, but we've identified different sections of the budget book where we've referred to Measure B and how the city is using Measure B resources to maintain services within the general fund. And so that slide is there for your reference as you're preparing your report. On the next slide, I wanted to kind of go back and set the stage because fiscal year 2020, 2021 was a very unusual year for us from a budgetary standpoint because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's going to make it an interesting year for this committee to consider the Measure B activity and your report to the City Council because the city really adopted what we called a status quo or baseline budget for last fiscal year. And that's because of the pandemic and the fiscal uncertainty that was surrounding it early on in the pandemic. We were actually building our budget in the January, February, March of 2020 timeframe when our retail industries were shutting down. And so we were concerned about the impacts on our sales tax revenue, which is our largest general fund tax revenues. And so because of that, we adopted what we considered really a status quo expenditure budget. We included in our general fund budget known increases to our CalPERS pension costs because we have to make those payments to CalPERS. We also included increases that we had to make to some of our departments to maintain the service levels that they provide. For example, if the cost of park maintenance contractors was going up, we increased the budget for the Parks and Rec department to cover those types of costs. From a city staffing perspective, we added very few augmentations unless we felt they were critical. I identified a couple here. There really were only a couple. We had a new high school open in Roseville, and so the police department added a school resource officer. And then our police dispatch center, the workload was overwhelming the level of staffing that we had there, so we added one more police dispatcher in this year's budget. But besides those, any other requests that we got through this budget development process for last year for the general fund were deferred. Departments, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 positions were requested by city departments just within the general fund. And we put those all on the back burner because there was so much uncertainty about the pandemic in those early months of 2020. And then our major general fund tax revenues, we start estimating our tax revenues around January, and so we had done pre-pandemic tax estimates. And then by March and April, when we were hoping to start finalizing the budget, that was when businesses were starting to close. People were told to stay at home because of the pandemic. And so we ended up reevaluating our tax revenues. And so part of the process on the next slide, you can see there, we identified what we called our pre-pandemic estimates that we had made in the January, February of 2020 timeline for our primary sales tax revenue. That's the 1% Bradley Burns. You see Measure B sales tax there. We were estimating at that point about $20 million. Our hotel tax was growing to about $4.3 million. And then property and other taxes made up that other $56 million for a total of about $140. But by April of 2020, when we were finalizing our proposed budget, we were reading and we were talking to people at the state and at cities throughout California. We were talking to our professional organizations, and economists were just trying to estimate what does this mean for the economy in California. And you've probably read the news about how the state of California reduced their tax estimates. They furloughed their employees. They made some significant cuts in their budget, and cities and counties throughout California made similar reductions. And so we ended up reducing our tax revenue estimates by $14 million down to that $126 million. And you can see for the Bradley Burns sales tax, that was a 15% reduction. At the time, we were looking at a variety of different scenarios. We were hoping 15% was enough because at that time, the mall was closed and we didn't know when it was going to open. and we were worried. We didn't know. At that time, we were hoping the pandemic was going to last a few months. I don't know if you remember that, but it kept going. And so our hotel tax, that transit occupancy tax, that's the hotel tax. You see, we wrote that down almost by 50% because at that time, most of the hotels were closed, and occupancy and room rates really dropped. And so that $14 million reduction led to a tax revenue budget of $126 million. And you see that number on the top of the next page. And so this was how we balanced our general fund budget last fiscal year. $126 million of tax revenue. We have another $32 million of a variety of types of other revenues that are primarily department revenues. Those are fees that are collected by the Parks, Recreation, and Libraries Department, a variety of other general fund revenues that other departments bring in, brings us to a $158 million revenue budget. And at that time, that status quo baseline expenditure budget was about $160 million. So we had about a $2 million shortfall. And we built our proposed and then adopted budget, assuming that if we needed to, we would transfer $2 million from the new general fund stabilization reserve to balance the budget. But at the time we adopted the budget, we told City Council we'd like to wait a number of months to see how this pandemic transpires, and that we would come back to the council after January of 2021 before recording that transfer, because we were hoping that the revenue impacts wouldn't be as significant. And the final result is we did not have to take any money out of the stabilization reserve to balance the budget. But on this next slide, one of the points that we made in a number of presentations is that had it not been for Measure B, we would have had a shortfall of $20.5 million, because at that point we were estimating $18.5 million of Measure B revenue. And had it not been for Measure B, we would not have built up that economic stabilization reserve to mitigate these kind of short-term economic impacts to our budget. And we would have had some significant reductions in fiscal year, not only 2020, 2021, but even the 1920 budget year, which was still coming to a close as the pandemic started in March of 2020. So we would have faced some significant reductions in both of those fiscal year budgets had Measure B not been passed when it did and generate the revenue that it has. So this next slide just summarizes briefly the two general fund reserves, the Economic Stabilization Reserve, where Council has established a policy target of 15% of general fund revenues. And the purpose of that reserve is to address shortfalls that are caused by an economic downturn, which is what we were experiencing early in the pandemic. And then the city also has an emergency reserve of 10%, which is really to address any other kind of unanticipated expenditures during any kind of emergency. And so the total reserve there is 25% of the general fund budget. And like I mentioned earlier, our policy is in your packet for your reference. So with that information about how we established the budget for last fiscal year, now we start transitioning to the actuals, because the actual economy did not behave like anyone expected. When you ask economists throughout the country and the world what they thought was going to happen with the COVID-19 pandemic and what has actually happened, it's really night and day. And there's a lot of surprises here. And so, like I mentioned, we wrote down our revenue estimates by $14 million, but our final actual revenues exceeded those estimates by $21 million. So had we not written them down, we still would have exceeded our initial estimates by $7 million, which would have been about a 4% variance. Our expenditures came in lower than budget by about $7 million. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And then we have some non-operating revenues and expenditures related to debt service and capital projects that exceeded the budget by about $500,000. And so the net result for the general fund for last fiscal year is a one-time surplus of $28.5 million that will fall to fund balance and be available for council to appropriate for one-time needs. So I wanted to share a little bit more detail about these results. So on the revenue side, you see that same $21 million number there at the bottom of this slide. And it's made up of our primary Bradley Burns sales tax, $13.7 million over that pandemic estimate. Measure B, $6 million over that pandemic estimate. Property tax, $3.3 million over its estimate. Our Parks, Recreation, and Library Program revenues came in under budget by $2.5 million, primarily because a lot of their programs were closed or canceled or had enrollment reduced because of COVID-related restrictions. And then our other revenues came in about $500,000 over budget. And that last line item includes over 100 different types of revenues, including the hotel tax, but also our development revenues. And then we had some revenues in that other category that came in under budget, like our passport center that the city clerk's office operates across the street was closed for a number of months because of the pandemic. And then, like I mentioned before, we did not need that $2 million transfer from the stabilization reserve. So the total of all of that is $21 million of revenue surplus. And then on the next slide, we have the expenditure side of the general fund results. Next slide, please. There we go. And you see down at the bottom that circle number is the $7 million that I mentioned on the expenditure side. And this is broken out by department. The very first row, general government, that refers to all of the support departments, the city council budget, the city manager budget, city attorney, city clerk, finance, HR, public affairs and communications. Those are all lumped into what we call general government. Then we have economic development and housing, development services, et cetera. And the bottom line here is that all of our departments came in within their budgets, totaling $7 million. You see police and fire there, the two departments that have the largest general fund budgets, spent virtually 100% of their budgets, and most of the other departments are in the 90 to 95% range. So then with that $28.5 million surplus, typically we would come forward to City Council and make some recommendations about how to use the general fund budget surplus. This year it's a little bit different because of the pandemic, because the surplus is larger than usual. We made some recommendations on some fairly urgent items. And then you notice down at the bottom, we're holding about $23 million because the City Council is having a priorities workshop at the end of this month where they're going to talk about their strategic plan goals, and their discussions on their priorities will help us determine what recommendations we want to make for the rest of this general fund surplus. But you notice there that we did recommend last week, and the council approved a budget adjustment for $5.4 million. Most of that money is going towards street resurfacing, and this is some major arterial roads in the city that are really needing repairs urgently because the quality of the pavement is getting so bad that if we don't repair it imminently, those segments of those roads are going to get so bad that the cost to repair them ends up tripling because we almost have to replace the whole roadway. And so that was why it was fairly urgent for some of those areas. And then we also have a fire truck that's coming up for replacement. That $700,000 is actually not the full cost to replace the fire truck. The vehicle actually costs $1.7 million. And the city has a fleet replacement process where we save up money over the life of a vehicle so that when it gets to the end of its useful life, with most vehicles, we have enough cash in the bank to buy a new one. But with fire trucks being so expensive, the cost of fire trucks escalates so much that we had only accumulated about $1 million of cash to replace that fire truck. And so we recommended using a little bit of that surplus to provide the difference so that we could fully fund the replacement of that vehicle. And then within the general fund, we have a $1.2 million contingency budget that's built in for unanticipated expenditures that happen during each year. And this year, our Parks, Rec, and Libraries department had a capital project to replace the aquatic center slide and water play area. And that project went over budget a little bit because of the pandemic causing supply chain issues and labor shortages. And so they needed a little bit more money, which we funded out of our contingency budget and then replenished with this budget adjustment. So the bottom line here is we went from that $28.5 million surplus down to $23.1 million that council will be discussing later this month at their workshop. So that leads me to the scorecard. So I've shared with you kind of how we started planning for that fiscal year in the pandemic with our revenue estimates, talked about how we ended the fiscal year with our revenues exceeding our estimates, how the departments spent their general fund budgets to deliver the services. And when we met in November, on November 30th, we discussed a draft of this Measure B scorecard. And this committee has talked about the need for some type of tool to help evaluate how we're doing with Measure B and to help you prepare a report to the City Council to serve the purpose of this committee. And we tried to create something with help of an outside consultant that would be easy to read and understand, but provide useful information that shows that Measure B resources are helping the city maintain the general fund services that the community expects and that the city heard about through the Engage Roseville process, through the Community Priorities Advisory Committee process. And so we took in your feedback and attached this final Measure B scorecard. But I'll call it final, but I'll also ask that you give us feedback so that we can continue to improve upon this tool in future years, because we want this to be a useful tool for this committee. And so I just put a screenshot here of the first page, but I wanted to talk about it on the next page. As I mentioned, we discussed it on November 30th. We've worked with the consultant to incorporate the feedback that you all provided into this final scorecard. We added explanations about the notable changes in the budget from fiscal year 2020-2021 compared to what we called that base year of 1920. There was a recommendation that we separate the investment in reserves from the department expenditure budget, so we did that and added a little bit more explanation about the reserves. We added some comments regarding the actuals compared to the budget. We didn't go into a lot of detail because then we would have been adding a lot more pages, but I thought it was important to note that the police and fire departments spent their budgets delivering the services that the community expects. And then we had some conversation about the National Community Survey and the fact that in our draft we had included a number of different measures, but the committee felt like some of them were relevant to the general fund services that Measure B covers, and some of those measures were not. So we deleted a few of those unrelated measures to try to focus in on the ones that you were interested in. And I think we had mentioned at that last meeting that National Community Survey is something that the city intends to do every other year. And so next year when we have this scorecard, that information won't be in here. So this report might shrink from 7 pages to 4 pages next year, unless we think of something else that we want to add to replace that information. But really the purpose of this is to help you craft your report to the City Council. And I thought you could either use it as an attachment to your report, or you could summarize it in your report. It's really up to you, but our goal was to give you something that was easy to read, that hopefully makes sense to you. And I won't go into any of the details that are in the scorecard. You have it for your reference. I'd be happy to answer any questions about it. This agenda item is for information only. There's no action necessary. I hope it's helpful to understand kind of the context of how we developed the budget, because it really was a status quo budget because of the pandemic. We really didn't add very much, and we didn't make reductions in our services either, which I think is important for this committee to recognize. And I think it's important to recognize, and we continue to recognize it, that the Measure B revenue came online at a time when it really saved the city from making significant reductions to general fund services that the community appreciates. And so with that, I'll just stop and open up for questions.
Before we do that, I have a point of order. We didn't take a vote on the approval of the minutes.
We didn't do all those in favor?
We did not do that.
Yes, thank you for taking that out of order, and we are past that item at this point, and so there was a motion and a second, and so I'm going to go back for a point of order of all those in favor in approving the minutes, please say aye.
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 And if any are opposed, please note that now. Just for the record, I do know that we took it out of order, and we'll note that for the minutes for next time. Thank you very much, Chair Kitchell.
Thank you. Okay, Dennis, thank you very much for your presentation and for all of the handouts that you provided to us beforehand. It was daunting to go through them all. I tried, but I did my best. And I do have a few comments, but first, before I address any questions I have, are there any comments or questions from the committee?
Not yet.
Not yet?
One quick one, Catherine. Can you flip back a couple of slides to the one that, Measure B scorecard? Here we go. Almost down to the very bottom, there's something called livability. What is that?
The National Community Survey included some questions about livability. So if you look on page 5 of the scorecard, there are some factors that the survey took into effect and categorized under livability. And if you would like me to read a few of them, one of them is quality of parks and recreation opportunities. One of them is a feeling of safety. One of them is economic health of Roseville.
So where's the money going?
Where's the money going? You're referring to
To a
measure,
consultant?
which, sorry, now I'm confused.
Under the livability category.
Under the livability category, well, under feeling of safety, I think
Well, no, just under that category general, who's
So
doing-
that's the
who's
results of
doing
a
it?
survey, not
Okay, so we're paying for the
categorization.
survey.
Well, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that's showing the results of a survey. It's not a categorization for an expense.
correct, that is correct.
But on the scorecard, it just says livability.
It, underneath the community indicator snapshot, it's referring to the results of the National Community Survey.
It's a classification of questions,
That's correct.
All right.
the detail of which, the various facets are listed on page 5 that are included in that classification of questions.
That's correct. And as I indicated, that survey is going to be repeated every other year. And so on that first page under those community indicator snapshots, next year I would expect that those won't be there.
Question, Dennis.
Yes.
The survey, is that conducted just for this committee and Measure B, or is that a citywide effort?
It was a citywide effort, and there was some robust communication about the outcomes of the survey, the results of the survey. It is a statistically valid survey, and it's done throughout the country. And one of the benefits of the survey is comparing how our residents and businesses feel about Roseville to cities throughout the country. And we thought it was a good set of kind of performance metrics to share with this committee, so that you can see how the community responded to the survey. And if this committee, doesn't find value in that kind of information, we could always drop it from future scorecards. But we thought it added a little bit of insight.
So if I'm interpreting this correctly, out of 130,000 roughly residents, 476 completed the survey?
We're getting closer to 150,000 residents.
But that's considered, I cannot say statistically
Yes, it is.
And then I think I asked at the last meeting, is there a way to determine breakdown of location in the city, demographics, or are they completely random? We don't know where they went.
It's a great question, and I don't have that
Yeah, I
answer
don't
with
know
me,
that
but I can try to follow up before our next
Wouldn't
meeting.
mind. Yeah.
Sure,
Thank
sure.
you.
Okay.
I have a question on that. So on the 150,000, how many are potentially eligible to participate in that survey? I mean, obviously, everybody's not going to participate. We're not going to have our kids do that. Is there an estimate on what the potential, the maximum participation level could be of those 150,000 residents?
It was sent to 3,000, I think.
That's correct.
Right, okay, all right,
Yeah,
right.
randomly to 3,000 residents.
Right.
Would you say it was sent to 3,000 households?
That is my guess, but I can
Which
find.
is a total, yeah, because that actually makes it more.
Yes, it says mailed at random to 3,000 Roseville residents, so I would imagine that was 3,000 households, correct?
I had a question on page 3 of the scorecard. Apologies, I'm using my phone to view it. This past fiscal year, 2021, you refer to that as fiscal year 21? Okay, thank you. And so I wanted to clarify, adopted expenditures of 166 million. If I remember correctly, or my notes are correct, I think the revised budget was 160, and then we actually were 7 million below that, or I'm trying to follow the numbers.
So which numbers are you comparing?
So adopted expenditures for fiscal '21 of the scorecard is a total of 166 million.
Right.
I believe this, one of the slides we just looked at showed the total expenditures were 160 million, and then we were below that budget by 7 million. So was the 166 the original budget?
I believe the difference is the investment in reserves that we pulled out of this table and moved to the next page, because we wanted to just show the department expenditures.
Oh, I see, okay.
So I believe in the draft that we had reviewed in November, we had it up there.
Oh, yes,
And
so
then
that
the-
was 7 million was transferred, okay, to the economic stabilization. Okay, so that ties to the 160. And I remember during our last meeting, we had debated back and forth, do we use budgeted numbers, do we use actual numbers?
Right.
Okay.
And so we landed on leaving it as budget because that really shows the decisions that council is making on how to allocate general fund resources in their budget process. That reflects their policy decisions. But that was why I wanted to identify in that notable changes section some information about the budget, but also a paragraph there about the actual expenditures and how the police and fire departments spent virtually 100% of their budget, and the other departments spent nearly 90% of their budget.
And then if we were to look at actuals compared to last year's, is fiscal '20 actual or budget?
That's budget as well.
Budget, okay.
Yes.
So if we were to look at actuals versus fiscal '20, it's really flat or maybe a slight decrease. If you're comparing the 160 million, or if you take the 166 and we said we are 7 million under budget, really our expenditures actual or under 160 then.
Yes, I'm following you.
Okay.
That's correct.
So one of the.
But I would add that that budget in 2020 of 160, our actuals for that year
Lower.
were lower.
Okay.
And so from a year-to-year standpoint, our actuals to actuals would have been higher.
So forgive me, I don't remember if it's in the documentation. Did we compare fiscal '21 to baseline? We had talked about that. I'm not sure if it's, I don't see it in the scorecard at least immediately, though.
We were talking about fiscal year 2020 being the
Our
baseline.
baseline, okay.
And I was already thinking about next year, identifying it as the baseline.
Okay.
And the committee had
that was the
suggested
first
even
full
adding
year.
a third year next year.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's so unusual. We talked about making sure that we had 3, yeah.
Right.
Just for my own knowledge, development services dropped 1%. Do you think that's just because we weren't opening new businesses during the 2021?
Are you referring to the little red circle next to the 1%?
Now, which 1%, negative 1% isn't huge. I'm
And
just curious as to lack of growth because of the.
Actually, that was related to one position that was reduced.
Okay.
And I described there in the little paragraph below it that they had temporarily added a position the year before to address a retirement and have some time to do cross-training. And then they took that extra position away. And that's the only reason it dropped by
That was
one.
actually a good thing. Okay.
It is.
On that schedule, I have a question on Public Works and Development Services, the increase in their expenditures, and I know you have a description down below of part of that, but it's 800,000 for each department, give or take. That seems a lot for 2 part-time building inspectors, and I guess I'm not quite sure that I follow the reimbursement timing difference.
I know it's not a real simple concept, but Public Works is a department that has a lot of different funding sources, and they get reimbursements from other funds into the general fund to help pay for some of their staff and services and supplies. And so when those reimbursements that come into the general fund go down, their net budget goes up. And that's a big part of what I found when I was doing that analysis. But on top of that, for both of those departments, not only do you have the positions that I mentioned, but like I mentioned in my presentation, we also increased our budgets for those known pension costs, would have affected all of the departments. But then within each department, they identify what are some of those other cost increases. I use park maintenance as an example in my presentation. Development Services was experiencing continued growth, and so we may have added budget for their services and supplies, for their consultants that help do plan check and other types of activities. So that may have been a factor there as well.
So Development Services in particular, if we look at that, the staff went down, but the costs went up. And part of that would be using outside consultants.
That would be part of it, as well as the couple positions that I mentioned there.
Okay. Any questions? Any more questions?
I'm good.
Just a thought that I think we should consider. The intended budget intended to grow from prior year by 3.5%. It would, numbers, representation of increase of services, maintaining services. Since we were under budget, it would make it more flat to last year's plan. Agreed plan was probably above actuals, but to me, that makes it more important to understand what happens with the excess, right? If the city council decides to use the excess towards increase of services, then that further supports the use of the funds. If for some reason city council uses it nothing to do with increase of services, then you could probably say that services were maintained, but it might be difficult to say that services were increased, right? I'm not sure if I'm making sense.
So let me try and paraphrase to see if I understand and perhaps just express it a little differently. If we look at the base year and we increase those total actual expenditures by 3.5% per year, that should get us to what the level of service would be compared to that year. Theoretically.
If we look at the base year, and the base year is 160, and we have an increase of expenditures, that represents an increase of services or maintaining services in theory. In this case, we didn't spend the full budget of 166 million, right? We were 7 million under budget, so we actually didn't spend more than last year's budget. So my point being, they have extra funds, and so if you almost it depends what they do with those extra funds to show that there was an increase of services.
May I
Yes.
comment on that? Because, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to identify in the scorecard in the reserve section that transfer of $7 million. Because what happened last year was that when we closed out the prior fiscal year 2019-2020, we had a surplus of about $7.5 million. And what council wanted to do with that money was add it to the reserve. And so to your point, I think it is something for the committee to consider. How does council use those one-time general fund surpluses at the end of the year? And I emphasize the word one-time because when we end a fiscal year and we have a surplus because we didn't spend all of our budget, it doesn't mean we're going to have a $28 million surplus every year because we're increasing our revenue estimates. And so we really look at that as one-time money. And so our recommendations to city council are usually going to be one-time in nature. A capital project like the $4.4 million that we recommended that they spend on resurfacing those arterial roadways. We want to make sure that they're not adding ongoing costs that we can't afford in the future. So we're recommending one-time things. One of the things that I presented to the council last week that we'll probably come back next month and talk about is using a little bit more of that surplus to replace some of our aging equipment for the police and fire departments. And we don't have enough general fund dollars to do that, and so having this one-time surplus provides a good funding source for that, and I think it aligns well with the Measure B principles.
Right.
So I think your point is a good one, that the committee ought to be looking at what does the council ultimately do with the surplus at the end of the year.
And remind me, with the contribution last year into the Economic Stabilization Fund, are we now at the 15% target? So there wouldn't be any additional contribution unless they decide to exceed the target?
So there was, when we built the current year budget for 21-22, as the budget grows, because it's a percentage, the reserve levels grow. So we did end up putting additional money into both reserves to maintain those target levels. And each year, we'll have to put a little bit more in. But yes, we are.
They could use some of this fiscal 21's excess to fund the economic, and that is,
Right.
would be in line with the Measure B principles. Okay.
Correct. And we are at those policy targets currently.
When is there a workshop in relation to when we do our letter?
It's before you do your, it's before
Okay.
you finalize your letter.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Do you think, or do you feel that they're going to use the majority of the overage, the over 21 million now at this point? Or do you think they're going to actually send that to reserves as well?
Currently, based on the current reserve policy, the reserves are at their target levels. So if they did that,
it all.
they would probably be, voting to increase the reserve levels. And there hasn't been discussion of that at this point that I'm aware of. So at this point, I don't know what the recommendations will be.
So maybe to Megan's point, and it wouldn't be this year, but next year when we finalize 21-22, we could use as a PS or postscript, in 2021, they did this with this money. So maybe that's how we cover that, since we won't know yet. But we will then.
Right.
And my intent is to include that in the scorecard, because I think it is valuable information, and it's certainly one of the filters that we look through when we're making recommendations to council.
Maybe that takes the place of the
National Community Survey?
yeah, where
Sure.
the additional 20 million went.
Actually, I like the survey because I think it tells us if the community is happy with the services they're getting. And I think that's a critical component.
I just meant in 2022 when we
Yeah.
don't have recent numbers,
Oh, right.
because we won't have recent numbers until 2024 from the 2023 survey.
Yes, when we're evaluating 2023, yeah.
Yeah.
I can look at this all in a slightly different perspective, and that is that the survey indicates that the community, at least so far, is fairly happy with the services they're getting. The budget was sufficient for the services last year, and we had a surplus. So the regular revenues outside of Measure B covered the budget. So we could look at the Measure B funds as sort of excess. That would be one way to view them and say that how you utilize those would be critical for the future. And I would highly recommend that the council put more in the reserves, either set up a new reserve or some other way of making sure that those funds are available, because in this particular year, they're in excess. You're right, it's a one-time excess. And I think it would be important to have that available to provide the basic services in case we ever need them in the future. So I guess I took a just slightly different approach, which was to look at the revenues without Measure B. That covered our budget. Our budget was sufficient, even though it is tight and thin, but it was sufficient for this last year to cover the services and provide the quality of services that Roseville is known for, at least according to the survey, if we want to add validity to that survey.
I would say the only nuance to that would be We had a positive variance on revenue of 21 million, and the Measure B revenue was 24.5. So we did use a little bit of it, but your point is makes sense to me. And you could consider as a committee in your report making those types of recommendations.
And I think it's a valid point to point out that they held back and restricted services to make sure that their budget was sound for this year because there were so many unknowns. You mentioned they turned down hiring 30 staff, and so had it been a non-COVID year, I imagine you would have hired some of that staff. Yeah.
And as Measure B is written, is there a requirement to use the percentage of funds in one way or another?
There is not. Measure B was passed as a general tax, and so the revenue comes into the general fund like our property tax, like our Bradley Burns sales tax, and then is used for the general fund services, with the three largest departments being police, fire, and parks, rec, and libraries.
Comments? No? No comments? All right.
Chair Kitchell, I recognize there's nobody in the audience, but if we could open it up for public comment, please and thank you for the record.
Are there any public comments? Do I have one or more volunteers that are interested in
Wait.
preparing?
Hang on, we're not on that item quite yet. That was item 6.1.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes,
Yep.
you're right. You're right. I need to go back up here. Well, I'll say it again. Thank you for the presentation, Dennis. It was very helpful, and we will now move on to item 6.2, report to the council. For this item, staff is recommending the committee approve a motion to designate one or two committee members to prepare the committee's report to the city council. I understand that you have a presentation here.
Hello again. Yes, it's very short. But yes, the recommendation is to identify one or two of the committee members to present the report to the city council. And we say one or two because the Brown Act limits your ability to meet outside of this meeting to prepare the report and to present it to the city council. Of course, the city council meeting is a public meeting, so you could all attend. But we have to limit the preparation of the report to one or two of you. On the next slide, we show our annual budget cycle. You may have seen this graphic in our budget book, but you can see we're kind of in the February to March timeframe. We're starting to build the budget for next fiscal year already, fiscal year 22-23. And this process with this committee has kind of been established to review last fiscal year once we have audited financial statements, so we know that that surplus number is final. And that's what we're doing tonight. You'll have a few weeks to prepare a report to present to the city council. We've scheduled our next committee meeting for March 8th, which I believe is also a Tuesday. And the goal of that meeting is to review and approve the draft report, either as is or with modifications that you decide to make at the meeting. And we've tentatively scheduled for the committee to present that report to the city council on March 16th at their second meeting in March. And then I added this last bullet here just to remind us that unless there's a need for some other type of meeting, the next committee meeting would be around this time next calendar year to review the fiscal year 2021-2022 information. So with that, I will open it up to any questions. But the staff recommendation is, like you said, to approve a motion to identify one or two committee members to prepare a report. And last year it was in a memo format, which we included in your packet as a reference. And it could certainly be a memo again. Or like I said, you could attach the scorecard, or you could create your own report and summarize the scorecard. It's really up to this committee. And then present that report to the city council. And they'll take that input as part of their information as we develop the budget for next fiscal year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Any questions or comments from the committee?
Just a question. So that report would be prepared, and then we would discuss it, and then a vote to approve or amend as it is.
Correct.
Correct. If we can do, if there's no other questions, if we do public comment first, and then we can talk about nominations and interest and things like that.
Okay. Any public comments? Seeing none, I will close public comment. Do I have one or more volunteers that are interested in preparing the committee's report to the council, to the city council?
I'll help.
Okay.
So I
do
participated
it
the
again?
last 2 years, so
Yes,
I'd
you
love to
can.
pass on the torch to share the love.
Okay. Anyone?
I'm kind of in the same boat as Megan, but
Oh,
Okay, I can help with that then.
okay, good.
Okay,
We're in.
all right.
You guys got it.
Okay, so to formally handle this then, there has been an interest expressed by Commissioner Spate and by Chair Kitchell to help prepare the report. So Chair Kitchell, if you'd like to entertain a motion to designate Commissioner Spate and Chair Kitchell as the two committee members that will prepare the committee's report to the City Council, a motion would be in order at this time.
Do I have a motion to appoint Commissioner Spate and myself to the preparation of the report?
I will make that motion.
Okay,
Good.
thank you. Second?
second.
Okay, we have a
Let's do a roll call vote on that.
motion and a second. Yes.
I guess we've got to vote yes.
Okay, all those in favor?
We're going to do a roll call vote on that real
Oh,
quick.
sorry.
So Terry.
Chair Kitchell,
Aye.
Vice Chair Krafka,
Yes.
Committee Member Duffy,
Yes.
Committee Member Hill,
Yes.
and Committee Member Spite.
Yes,
The motion passed.
seemed like a good idea at the time.
Fine.
Okay. Any more?
That's it. There's no round table or any discussion. The next item on the agenda
Is
truly
the
is
adjournment.
adjournment.
Can I have a motion for adjournment?
Second.
Oh, somebody's got to move first.
I motion so. Motion for adjournment?
All those in favor?
Wait, who is, so Commissioner Duffy,
I presented the
and who
motion.
made the second? Okay, Commissioner Spate made the second. Okay, now we can do all those in favor.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, great.
Thank you for help.